Other than the podcast itself, the best way to stay in touch with our various goings-on is to be on our mailing list. To sign up, go to spotlightonpodcast.com and click on Newsletter. Thanks. Hello and welcome to Spotlight On, the companion podcast of thetonearm.com. Here we talk with the musicians, writers, and innovators shaping media, art, and culture. I'm your host, Lawrence Purrier. Today the spotlight shines on saxophonist and composer Ingrid Laubrock. Ingrid's just released Purposing the Air, a double album that sets 60 brief poems by Erica Hunt to music through 4 different vocal-instrumental duos. It's an ambitious project, one that transforms Hunt's emotionally sharp koans into what Ingrid calls a library of moods, each piece capturing a different feeling, from the everyday to the searching. The project began during Ingrid's master's studies, when she met Hunt through a friend and connected immediately with the poet's work. What started as writing for one duo became something much larger, a collection where poems float through musical space, each tailored for specific performers like Faye Victor and Mariel Roberts, or Theo Bleckmann and Ben Monder. I'm so pleased to bring you my conversation with Ingrid Laubrock. I'm curious about your move from London to New York, and if you could tell me a little bit about what was going on in each of those cities from a working musician's point of view, and what prompted you to move?
So the main reason for the move, really, like working backwards, is that my now husband and I had like a long distance relationship for about 3 years. And there was like a cross point. So there was a point where one of us would have had to move. And the agreement was basically, I'll try New York, and if it ends up being not working out, we'll reconfigure. But obviously, as a jazz musician, somebody who's grew up playing jazz, New York is an incredible playground for music, and has an incredible wealth of talent and musicianship.
What was happening in London at that time? It seemed like, in the early teens, the jazz scene kind of, I don't want to say exploded, but evolved in a much different way in London.
Yes.
There seems to be more of a vibrant scene over the last 10 or 15 years than had existed for a while. Could you talk about that?
Yes, I think what happened, like what at least happened in my personal journey, for want of a better word, is that in the early 2000s and 90s, I want to say, we founded a collective called the F-IRE Collective. The person who really started this collective is a percussionist, a saxophonist called Barak Shmuel, and he was friends with Steve Coleman, so he was very into rhythmic music and into the idea of a collective. So we the initial idea was to do something akin to MBA, so follow that kind of plan.
Yeah.
And it developed into a collective of musicians who really couldn't find a home in the mainstream scene that was so prevalent in London. It was really like a post-pop scene where not much else worked. Or you would have the complete free players, who were also super interesting, but were not interested in composition or were not interested in playing on forms, etc. So there was a bunch of us in the middle who felt like we didn't really find a place, and promoters wouldn't touch us. Organizers were worried that it wasn't jazz enough, etc., etc. So we rotted together and were really, really active. We had a festival, of several festivals. We had a label. We had nights spread out over the city. Series. Basically, I had my own series. Like many of us had this. We would share resources. At the time, it was mailing lists. We would basically share everything. We were sharing musical resources. So we'd had a string quartet in there. We had a samba school. We had West African percussion groups. Barak was a percussionist and also a teacher at City University. We could use their rooms to practice also large-scale pieces. We really basically shared.
Yeah.
So it just became much larger, and there was a point where press and where promoters could not ignore us. We had non-profit status, so we could also apply for grants, so the whole thing kind of grew. And musically, it was super interesting because it was a sort of like anything goes, but it has to be good and it has to be, we still had a sort of a deciding, there was a quality control, basically. We didn't just like take anybody into this collective. There was a certain like aesthetic alignment, even though it was quite wide. And there was a point where this collective was like younger people wanted in. We said like, well, that if we grow too far, too big, this is not manageable. So why don't you have your own collectives and we umbrella you in? So we started sharing with other collectives that became sort of our sister collectives. We had a good rapport with similar collectives in France, Denmark, the Netherlands, so we really kind of, it was a sort of a thing of musicians taking it into their own hands a little bit more, being proactive. And I felt, for the first time really, I felt really sort of at home musically in a sense of, it was just this network, this network and the support and the learning together, the studying together, the constantly practicing together. That was a real fertile ground.
Yeah.
It really made me grow.
You ended your comment right where I wanted to begin, so thank you. I'm curious about how having that collective and having that known group of musicians and colleagues, how did that aid in your development as a composer?
Well, the really nice thing, and I will, this is also a reason why I'm always very happy to also be a side person, is that we learn so much from each other, right? And when you have the resources to not just rehearse for a gig, but you rehearse for the sake of the music, you can ask the composer questions, you can ask, why did you organize it like that? All of that. If you have a curious mind, it lets you to study and to search where maybe somebody else has come from. So at that time, with the F-IRE Collective, we researched a lot we looked a lot into rhythm, into cultures that are based on African rhythm, mostly have their roots in African rhythms. But later on, I also came much more. This is really a little bit post-collective. When I moved here, I discovered the AACM for myself a little bit more, and just the wealth of creativity that comes out of those composers makes you then revisit sources that maybe they have used, but also brought out a sort of a more experimental side in me, because they were so attuned and are so attuned to their own creativity, as well as very like knowledgeable about other musics that have been there before them.
Yeah.
I've always been interested in classical music as well. I grew up in a kind of classical music household, so that side has always been there. And as it has informed so much jazz in the past, I studied that a lot too.
I was curious about about the influence of your family life, because it sounds like there was also quite a literary influence that you got from both of your parents, or a love of words. And I wonder if you could talk to me a little bit about that, what the role your parents played in sort of your intellectual and creative development.
Yes, I think my parents play a huge role, but they were never like dogmatic about it. So I think both my parents are completely crazy, or my father passed away, but are or were completely crazy about music. They both sang in choirs, so I would and they would sing these kind of things like St. Matthew Passion or St. Johann Passion, so long form pieces. And I would be there as a kid listening to it. And it didn't really as a young kid, I guess it didn't really occur to me that long music wasn't an issue, that long form music was just something you kind of delve into.
Yeah.
The other thing is that my father played these kind of musical games with us. Like I remember, for example, driving home from school with him, and we would try and sort of like hold the pitch in our head and try and guess what pitch that was, and we both race to the piano and play it. So there's a certain like a really playful sense of interaction with music that I think, for example, helped me massively with pitch recognition, which is a big part of improvising. But it was kind of given to me in a playful way. I grew up in the countryside. Music wasn't my first love as a kid was playing with animals and being around animals, just because of the nature of where I grew up. But music was always there.
Yeah.
And literature was also always there. My father was crazy about Beethoven and crazy about Goethe, and like absolutely obsessively crazy about it. So there was a sort of a deep appreciation, I would say, for for the classical side of things coming from my dad. And my mother had always a very intuitive and she's also a very knowledgeable, intellectual kind of person, but she has a real intuitive connection to music, like a very emotional connection to music from an early childhood. Like she has that. She grew up in a very poor surroundings, and she's always used music as a refuge, which is also obviously a big part of yes, I want to say of any musician's life is the refuge in music that we have.
I'm also curious about some of your early teachers and mentors, Jean Toussaint, Dave Liebman. Might you be able to cite maybe a lesson or something from your studies with them that has stayed with you and informs your work today, or informs maybe even you philosophically?
Yeah, I think with Jean Toussaint, he gave me lessons when, like, as a beginner, as a fair beginner, I played for about 2 or 3 years when I asked him for lessons, and he took me on, I think, because he heard how much I wanted it, because he actually told me he doesn't teach beginners, but he took me on anyway. I think the biggest takeaway for me out of all the lessons with him was that he would play at me and make me copy him for hours, which was, I think, at the time really a great thing to do, because I had grown up playing classical music. There was that disconnect for when the music is no longer in front of you, right? You're so used to playing with something and reading something. I played classical piano as a child, and so just basically copying by ear for hours at a time and trying to copy his sound and emulate his sound was, I think, the biggest takeaway from it. He did pass on some of his harmonic systems, etc. But for me, the visceral copying it, hearing a huge tenor sound directed at me and trying to emulate, that was great. He also made me write my own solos.
Wow.
That was sort of a beginning of composition, although I didn't think about it at the time. He was very, very honest with me at a time where I really needed it. He simultaneously kind of destroyed me and then built me back up in the space of 15 minutes.
You're not the first artist who's told me that about Liebman. In fact, he comes up, something that's amazing is how many people he's taken the time to work with over the years, but also it sounds like he's a tough teacher.
Oh, he's very honest. He's really old school that way, but he's really honest, and I very much appreciated it, because people generally aren't honest with you, you know, and it's also very difficult to be honest when you're actually criticizing somebody. He brought out this kind of, you know, I was always driven and I was always motivated, but he nudged it up even more. So I went, after I had taken part in one of his master classes, I went back to Germany, where I hadn't lived at the time for over 10 years. I went back to my mother's house and basically took some sort of self-directed sabbatical from whatever I was doing and only practiced. So I practiced like 8-10 hours a day or something like that for 6 months. And then I did the same again later for a few months, like 2-3 months or so. Because I had basically moved to London and immediately lived from music, although I couldn't play it all. And I was so motivated to make my own way and to pay my own rent, even as an 18-year-old, that, you know, I had never had that time that people had when they go to school where they really just shed. So that was my shedding time. He motivated that in me. And then this was after me going to 2 of his master classes in Pennsylvania. After that, whenever he was in London, I was kind of his driver. So it was really like a mentorship. Like I would drive him around to his recording sessions or to his mixing sessions to have his mouthpiece made, to, you know, he can really hold court and he can really talk about music. So there was just so much wisdom coming from him, you know. It was really beautiful. I for years.
That's so old school.
It is very old school, but for years I sent him CDs and I would like ask him for his criticism and stuff. And he would always take the time. Like which I hugely appreciated, because he's like a really busy man, you know, who was traveling a lot. But
right.
Yeah, I think in a sense, although he was so honest and he was like so direct, he also was very giving and he took time. Plus, you know, for me, he played with Miles Davis and with Elvin Jones. So, you know, how You go to it felt like I'm going as close to the source as I can possibly go this day and age.
Yeah, if you're going to take feedback or criticism from anybody, it's pretty good. It's a pretty good lineage to take input from.
Exactly. And because I was so mainly unschooled and mainly an autodidact, I took, whenever I had these kind of relationship, however brief they were, I would take these things to heart and try and get as much as possible out of them.
My understanding is Purposing the Air is really your first major work involving words and voices. What drew you specifically to the Erica Hunt Mood Librarian text? And at what point in this project did the text inspire the project, or were you looking for a way to fuse words with music?
I was actually at the time doing my master's. This was during the pandemic, and I had not, because I didn't have any formal qualifications, and both my husband and I are musicians. I thought that would be the time where I could actually try and get a qualification. So in case this pandemic wasn't going to end and then we need to get a teaching job or anything like that. So I did a master's in composition. And the first duet that we were going to the first group we were composing for, one of the options was Ari Streisfeld and Rachel Calloway. So this is how it started. I picked it sort of was a little random start because I don't think voice and violin would have been my first choice, but we were in the middle of a pandemic and they are married and they could play together, they could work together in the same room. All the other groups would have had to open up their part and do these kind of laborious recordings. And I was just so fed up at that point in time with anything overdub. So I went for the kind of unusual voice violin combination. And I actually really fell in love with writing for them, especially for the violin. At the time, I was looking for words by somebody who's still alive. Erica came to mind. I met her at a party just before the pandemic started. And we had a really long conversation. We talked about poetry. We talked about all sorts of things. I really liked her a lot. So I ordered her book and read through it, her collection, Jump the Clock. And I read through it. And those, to me, stuck as good material for compositions.
Yeah.
And then once I got started on writing for Ari and Rachel, I just got so into it. I just wanted to do all of them.
What do you find first from the text? Is there a rhythm in the words, or do the words conjure melody? I'm really curious, and at the risk of asking you to deconstruct process, I'm really curious, like, what's your way into the text musically?
I feel it was different for many of them, but I think as a whole, the words and the rhythm came first. So there was a sense of like speaking them, sensing the rhythm, so that I feel like there's a sense of my own natural rhythm that flows into this. So I sang them and then played around with them. And then I feel like the instrumental treatment is more orchestrating the vocal in that sense.
Yeah.
But sometimes some of the words are really, really short. So there's not that much to play with. And I think in those cases, I was coming at them from the other way around. So be maybe starting on the musical thought and see like how I can direct it to the vocals. And then there were a few of them where I really intuitively just connected with the mood of the poem.
Yeah.
They're really open and you can read into them. I think there's no like clear meaning in many of them. And as the poem, the overarching title is Mood Librarian, I kind of took her by her word, sometimes just went for a mood that the poem gave me.
Yeah, it's fascinating. It's almost an ideal textual context for music, right? Being more evocative, less literal, more open to interpretation.
Yes.
Along those lines, I'm curious about, in this instance, writing for others rather than doing the performing yourself. What are you delivering to your artists or your interpreters in that case? And specifically, how do you maintain creative control while allowing your performers room for interpretation? That seems like it would require some intentionality on your part.
I mean, I try and get at least I try and compose for the performers, and I think that is really the jazz side of things. Like I love Mingus, I love Duke Ellington, people who write these kind of little frameworks and they control those for their players. So I try and in a way, front load listen to the performers' music and try and see them live if I can, if I'm around. And in all the cases, Sarah, Mariel, Matt, friends, Ben Monder and Theo, Bleckmann, I've worked with both and I've seen them play so many times. So there's that makes it a lot easier to imagine what you can write for them. With Ari and Rachel as the classical musicians, I knew I had to write everything out. And I think that is why the singing the rhythms and singing the words became really important to me. So that I could still bring something in that is me. Also the rhythmic interaction between the violin and the voice. I was sort of thinking how can I bring the thing that interests me in rhythmic interaction, for example, in improvisation, how can I bring this a little bit into this classical duo so it still sounds like I wrote it? Similarly, the way I deal with intervals and with intervallic relationships, that is kind of my language, and I wanted to bring this into that classical duo setting.
Mm-hmm.
So for them, I wrote everything out. For people like Mariel Roberts and Faye Victor, Mariel, I know from a music context. So I have composed for her before, and I know she can read absolutely everything, every tiny detail, and she's very happy to do it. She also has a great time, and she's a great improviser. So I knew I could throw a lot of different things at her, and that made her parts a lot more concise than, for example, Faye Victor's, because she has such a strong deliverance and improvisational skill that I didn't want to rein her in. I think I wrote more for the instrumentalists in general. And then we had rehearsals that checked with them if something isn't possible. I went over to Ben in Monder's house to work with him on his, to let him show me his effects and what they can do, because I know nothing about it. So it's cooperation and collaboration as well as writing for people.
We'll be back with more Spotlight On and Ingrid Laubrock right after this break.
After listening to this episode, head to thetonarm.com, our new online journal covering unexpected music and culture. This week on The Tone Arm, jazz clarinetist Kenan Azmeh discusses how his music has changed meaning in the aftermath of the Syrian uprising. Theatrical duo Charming Disaster on how a decade of perfecting their brand of haunted vaudeville led to their latest album, The Double. And French multi-instrumentalist and label manager Arthur Arsène shows his appreciation for the deployment of noise and the art of texture. You'll find all this and more on The Tone Arm. And while you're there, be sure to subscribe to our email newsletter. That's thetonarm.com. The Tone Arm, putting a needle on the cultural wax.
And now, back to Spotlight On. It's really beautiful, the amount of time you spent understanding each of your interpreters or each of your musicians on this project. I love hearing those anecdotes. I'm curious about the different relationship dynamics between the various duo participants. My understanding is you have, you mentioned Faye and Mariel, who my understanding is were strangers or at least not collaborators. And then you have the other extreme of a married couple.
Yes.
Yeah, that's so that also seems rather deliberate on your point. Like, let's take these pieces and put them together, and having some confidence that what will come out on the other side will be interesting, successful, or however you'd categorize it. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the role of the relationship dynamics.
Yeah, I feel like part of like making a good record, or part of making good music, is really the characters and is the musicians you put together. I think I've always been good at putting bands together, or in being able to imagine combinations of people work with each other. In the case of Sarah Serpa and Matt Mitchell, they have worked together, for example, but not hadn't really worked as a duo. But I just went to one of Sarah's concerts at Roulette, and that they had a very, very brief duo moment in the middle of it. And I was like, this is it. I can make this totally right for this. Sometimes it's as easy as that. Like, you just sit in a concert and something like you listen to a concert and something sparks off an idea, and then you just go and make it work. So I knew they have a rapport. I knew they both have so amazing time, like a really centered feel of rhythm. So it's almost like trying to figure out what makes this musician special, and writing to bring that out, which I think is what Duke Ellington did, for example. With Mariel and Faye, I reached out to them individually because I knew that they didn't know each other. So I didn't want to put them in a situation where they're like, can't really quite see it. And both of them were so keen on it. They had met each other once before, and then I saw some of the situation, and they just really hit it off, and they really enjoyed it. It was just a lucky coincidence, like that, what I kind of cooked up in my head worked out on a human level.
Yeah, your intuition served you.
Yes. I mean, I find it also like I'm just really, I like collaborating with people, and I prefer working with people who get on with each other. It's not needed. We don't need to work with people. We don't need to create this kind of, I know you're from a rock background, I think, right?
Yeah, somewhat. I mean, my days are
you have an interest in?
Yeah, younger. Professionally, it's how I pay the bills. But my jazz and creative music is where I spend most of my listening time. Yeah.
Okay, but I think we don't need to. There's so much talent out there. I don't think we need to live in this.
Yeah.
We're fighting with each other while we're making music.
Yeah.
This can be good for a minute, but
yeah,
it's not sustainable.
Something that's fascinating about all of this is, again, you're foreshadowing one of the questions I wanted to ask you, which was the idea of purposing. And so much of this project seems to have been infused with this intention, whether it was like the time you gave in understanding each musician before inviting them in, or allowing your intuition to suggest some of the pairings. I'm curious if you could talk a little bit about the word purposing and purpose, and what that means to you as a collaborator, as a composer, as what I would call like a producer of a project. It's a fascinating word.
Yes, it is. It is actually from a lyric. I don't know if you saw the poster in the middle of the record. Yeah, there is one of the poems, 59, is birds purpose the air as you purpose pen and paper, which is like what we turned into. The producer, David Breskin, suggested that as a title because the original title, Mood Librarian, is being used for something else by Erica. So this is how we arrived at the title. But I always felt that many of my projects are like, there's an hour-long record. And there's no like break. Basically, I think of a sort of set length curve, even if they're like breaks between my pieces. Because I love improvised music, and I often find the transitions are just as interesting as the composition itself. So I think of the whole thing. I think of a curve of roughly an hour, 40 minutes to an hour. Yet here, all the pieces were like so short. But because there's so many of them, I always felt like this would be a space where these poems just kind of float through, so all in all, they become kind of a long space with silences and little floating statements.
Is it collage in that regard?
I don't see it as a collage.
Mosaic?
More of a three-dimensional space. At least this is my hope that these, like maybe like thoughts that kind of puff through your consciousness and then disappear again, that kind of thing almost.
Yeah.
I think that's why I liked the word purposing the air. So I felt like here's the space and purposing it with these little fragments and these miniature pieces.
I get that. As a listener, I find that I notice the thoughts more than the transitions, if that makes sense. Like I found myself being drawn in by a statement or a moment and not necessarily, I heard it as a suite almost.
Yes.
Very subtle transitions.
Yes. No, I mean, when I was referring to transitions, I meant my usual music, like that. Yes, not on this record. There's no real transitions. I guess the transitions are silent, right?
Yeah.
I meant I usually function like most of my music has this kind of long form thing with transitions that lead into sometimes within pieces.
Yeah, right. With those improvised moments where you're figuring out where you're going next or what have you.
Yes, exactly. Where we're like, yes, and for me, like this stood out. But I think that because I don't have this, like I really wanted to do something where just as the poems kind of have one idea or maybe two ideas, maybe they have an idea or they have an ambiguous idea because they're koans. I wanted to also limit the writing to that. So it's an idea per poem, maybe two ideas per poem, but it's like they're really self-contained and they exist by themselves. But because they're organized per duet, there is still kind of a sense of that here is a set of music that exists by itself.
Is that type of compression or distillation, was that difficult for you, or was that a challenge you were ready for? Or because there's something minimalist in that approach, right? Whereas sometimes improvisation can become, in the wrong hands, a bit maximalist.
Yes, it can go there for sure. Actually, it was
something almost chamber-like in this, in this music.
Yeah, it was, to me, it was a real fun, like a meditation, a game.
Yes.
I think I describe it in the liner notes. It became sort of somewhat a travel companion also because I was riding on the road, and it kind of helped me. My life is pretty like disjunct at this point. Like I'm always a little bit here, a little bit there, just traveling a lot. And music has always been the thing that kind of holds it together. This was helping me even more because I could find this. You must know this too because you write, but look, when you write, there's a certain stillness and a certain focus.
Oh, yeah.
Like it's really a gift, I find, like having the time to write and having the time to be with your own thoughts at your own time, in your own time, not having to, it's a focus that is really unequal. It's a very different focus to playing where you're really concentrating, maybe almost more on what the other musicians do than what you do. This is really your kind of your own time, like thoroughly just enjoy the whole process of it.
Yeah, I do understand what you mean. There's that focusing or that tunnel vision that happens where when I think about those moments, there's just what's right in front of you.
Yeah.
And even your peripheral vision sort of is gone. And it's just,
exactly.
I guess it's what the overused term of the flow state, when we have those moments where it's actually working and we're connecting with the work, it's exciting.
It's really exciting. And it's a different flow state. Actually, when you're playing with other musicians, it is kind of the same state, but it is a little bit more outward directed. And this is the one where it is really like inwardly directed. And I just love both. I love the fact that you can be slow when you're writing, because when you're playing, you kind of, it's a different sense of alertness, I think.
Yeah, well, your collaborators are there, and they get it. They get an opinion as well.
They throw things at you, and that you can't ignore.
Have you seen much of a change in your compositions or your compositional approach as a result of your master's work?
This particular master's was awesome because they kind of let you do what you want to do, and that you have advisors that just guide you. There's no, it's very undogmatic. People come from all sorts of walks of life and all sorts of musical backgrounds.
Yeah.
The advisors that I had, they were really advisors. They were helping me. I think the thing that really went through the roof and got so much better as my notation skills. So I'm much, much better at, which is actually really great when you write for classical musicians. So I'm much, much better at notating what I'm hearing. So that is a good skill.
Well, interesting.
The advisors changed every term. So one of them was a violinist. So I learned a lot about string instruments, which was awesome. I love learning about other people's instruments. Just to go more in depth into other people's instruments. Was a great addition, I think, to my skills. And then the advisor I had over the last 2 terms was incredibly open-minded, and he introduced me to a lot of music I hadn't known. So I checked out a lot of music that I probably wouldn't have if I hadn't met him. We're still in touch.
Like what?
That's a good question. I knew that was going to come, and now I'm trying to think about it. But he introduced me to a lot of like electronic music, and now I cannot. I would have to actually literally dig through my.
That's okay. How about in your role as a teacher? Like, because you just said something interesting, which is learning about other people's instruments. In your role as a teacher, you're learning about other people while you're teaching them, right? Their approach, their capabilities, their limitations, where they're stuck. I'm curious how being a teacher impacts your own development.
I think the most my teaching jobs give me is that it's such a give and take. Like, for example, if I teach somebody composition at the new school or so, these are usually people who've asked me to give them private lessons, but they're in their 20s and they have completely different references. So it's a great exchange. Like, they show me what they're into and I show them maybe something that refers to it, but it's from a different decade, So I always feel like out of composition lessons, with one-on-one composition lessons in the new school, for example, I come back pretty enriched myself because they check out a lot of stuff. They're smart people who are really curious and really driven. So it really does kind of become an exchange where you point each other to different resources, and it makes you check out more music, almost more things. Yeah, I think my teaching is pretty limited. I don't do that much of it because I play a lot. So when I do it, I really do enjoy it, and I like interacting with people.
It must be a neat opportunity to see and hear music through not a beginner, but through to see it through that developmental eye again, or to take a student on that journey of pointing out a piece to them or revisiting a piece that was important in your development. It seems like it's a special gift.
It is very nice. And what is also really nice is like when you can, for example, if a student asks you like, how do you write this, or why did you write this? And you can point at what may have influenced you at the time, or what, and open their eyes to how you can turn influences into something else, rather than copying it. Those things are great moments for sure.
When I look at the list of some of the collaborators or the people you've worked with, Braxton, Mulhall, Richard Abrams, William Parker, wow, what we talked about gifts, what an amazing set of opportunities, but also musicians with very sort of like, I don't know, specific approaches to improvisation, or can you talk a little bit about how working with improvisers of those levels, as well as people who are incredible composers, what's that do for you?
Yeah, I think Anthony Braxton must be the person who I have learned most from, because I've played with him since 2011 in so many different contexts, and I'm always blown away by it. We just came back from playing the gala at Roulette for his 80th birthday here in Brooklyn, where we performed some of his pieces. Like every single time, I'm just amazed at how he found this kind of combination out of playing really challenging material, yet like making it sound so improvisational and keeping such a like open, multi-dimensional world.
Yeah.
Yeah, I can't describe it. His music is just bigger than anything else I've ever.
He's his own universe, really. When you
Yes, he is his own universe, and it is fascinating. It is really fascinating, and I've enjoyed every minute of it. Plus, obviously, as a saxophonist, I mean, he has, he's older now, but he had such a command of the instrument, such a command of his own language on it that it's so influential. After I got back from the gala, Darius Jones held a speech at the gala. Many different speeches, but Darius Jones was one of them. And he mentioned how for alto scared him when he was a teenager and then really influenced him. So I put it on the next day. And it still kind of blows me away how disciplined it in a way is, and how disciplined he moves through this language that's pretty abrasive, but how much technique there is in there and how much shape there is in those pieces, in those individual pieces. And at the time, it must have just really shocked people to do this on a major label. It's really a special thing. And I think that's the composers were part of the AACM, just the consistence with which they have really always done their own thing and continue to do so. Henry Threadgill he has just reported his new record, he's over 80, so there is the couple of times I played with more Richard Abrams, it was shortly before his death, and he was dancing in rehearsal, just the energy and the consistency to create new work is just
relentless. It's a relentless commitment to the work. Yeah,
really is. And in the case of Anthony Braxton, I do hold like an introductory class to some of my students about Anthony Braxton. Also, when I give workshops at universities, I always tell the students, I show them who's come out of him, like people like Steve Liebman or Mariel and Toussaint, who musically really don't sound like anything like him. And then there's many musicians on the classical side who were influenced by him, or people like Toussaint Braxton, who grew up listening to his dad's music, obviously. So, like, he has inspired people to do their own thing with great discipline, I think.
Yeah. I hadn't thought about the Mary Halverson or Toussaint in that way, but it's really amazing. They are singular generational voices on their instruments and still so young. And when you think about the runway in front of them, it's actually rather incredible what he spawned. Really is. As we sort of near the end of our time together, I'm curious, there's another musician that you've worked with quite a bit, this guy named Tom Rainey. And I'm wondering, obviously it's incredible to have such a multifaceted, close relationship with another musician and your personal connection, but can you just talk about, having your partner be a collaborator or someone who you use as again, another one of these musicians in your sort of stable of interpreters or participants in your work?
Yeah, I mean, he's a master. He's also honest and direct. So it's a real pleasure, to have him on my side. Like, he has to, like, we will play, for example, if I write music, we will play it here as a duet. We'll practice it as a duet. We still play together on most days, even if it's just like 20 minutes or something like that. We'll just have a little moment where we improvise a piece together, for example. And it's never, it's thrilling for me to play with him. Plus, he's a drummer although he would say like he doesn't compose. He has a really sharp compositional sense, and he very much gets involved in the overall shaping of the piece and the compositional side of the piece, much more than many drummers, I think. So I will always play in my compositions or my music that I wrote and see, and asking for his opinion, etc. It's has been a really fertile relationship, and we both enjoy.
Yeah, that's beautiful. My last question for you is, going back to very early on to an album like Who Is It, where you were getting you were the rising star, right? You were getting a lot of accolades as an up and comer, and as, nominations, etc. And then you get someone like Jason Moran calling you a visionary. You've had your share of third party accolades bestowed upon you, right? Pretty consistently over the years. How do you metabolize that, right? Like, do you want to accept those flowers, or do you need to not listen to that in order to, how do you accept the compliments that you're given?
Yeah, that's a very good question, and it's an interesting one. My friend Monica Vasconcelos, the singer I used to work with in London, she always said to me, like, you have to really learn how to accept a compliment, because I was never able to do it. I think what I've sort of settled on, or what I'm trying very hard to do, because, obviously not all press is, for example, positive. You also get people who do not like your music. So I try my very, very best to not take either too seriously, because it's difficult. Like you can ultimately only do what you think is right, or what resonates with you. I think you should accept compliments and you should accept criticism, but not too much. Like, to, not believe it too much in either way, in either direction, because this, as an artist, I think the more authentic you ultimately can be, the better for you, because that is what resonates. But then on your path to it, and there will always be some criticism that you need to kind of examine. And criticism is like the one side and praise is the other. So I think you need to be down to earth and level-headed as much as you possibly can, and for both of them. And it's not easy. It's just not an easy thing. Neither side is easy.
Yeah, I forget who it was who maybe the quote's attributed to many people, but if you're going to read the good reviews, you have to read the bad reviews. You can't just read the good ones.
Right. Oh,
and the converse is true too, right? You can't just beat yourself up. You have to be able to accept when something resonates.
Yeah, that's true. And I think the one thing that you really do have to do, because like I think most musicians, or many musicians, you come off a gig and you basically are pondering about what you just did. There's like, and I think no musician I know ever comes off a gig thinking like everything I did was brilliant. You just kind of ponder about it. And most musicians, we always learn. So we're always beating ourselves up about something.
Of course.
What I have learned over the years is that you cannot know what really went on, right? Because you're doing it. There's no objectivity, really. Like, you do not know what it was like on the outside. So if somebody comes up to you after a gig and says like, congratulations, I really enjoyed it, it was really great, you have to accept it, even if you did not love everything you did yourself, because they were part of it. And if they had a good experience, then
it was their night out.
It is their night out, and I think you have to gracefully accept it and leave the pondering for a little bit later.
Yeah.
Because it takes, the audience is just as much a part of this. They're a very, very important part of it. And there's kind of a communion that goes on while you're doing it, and while your focus at the afterwards. So your focus afterwards can't just be on the things that you did not like about yourself.
Thank you so much, Ingrid Laubrock. And as always, thank you for listening to Spotlight On. Spotlight On is executive produced and hosted by me, Lawrence Purrier. We're produced and marketed by Michael Donaldson. Editing and sound design is by Terry Grant, and our theme music is by Q-Burn's Abstract Message. Thank you so much for supporting our work. Please rate and review us wherever you listen to podcasts, and then visit us online at spotlightonpodcast.com. While you're there, explore the free episode archive. And for more interviews and writings from me and a diverse array of contributors, check out thetonarm.com. Thanks for listening, be safe, and stay in touch.